Continuing our coverage of the federal petition to create a water management area designation for the Keauhou Aquifer, today we have a portion of the presentation to the Hawaii County Council made by the National Park Service a few months ago. The debate over how to manage water resources in Kona is heating up as the State Water Commission considers the designation. We will continue with this presentation in tomorrow's newscast.
I'm going to talk to you today about three things, really. Just a little bit more, though you've heard a lot today during the site visit, on the historical significance of water to this area, then really try and give you a background in a very brief form on Hawaii water law as a context for understanding how the water code works and what this designation thing is. So I will try my best to respond to some of the issues Councilmember Ford and a member of the public, Bo Kahui, mentioned earlier, and then really go into detail on what is designation and what does it mean. After I talk, Dr. Paula Coutillo, the hydrologist, will go into some of the scientific details that really are what gets to the water code's language of, may there be a threat? And she can cover the threat from the scientific perspective. I think you've seen this image perhaps before, and this is what Fred Cacciola, whose signature is at the bottom right hand of the left-hand page, the cover letter for the Spirit Report for Koloko Honokohau. When I was asked by the National Park Service to help with this effort, I was really stunned when first thing I was handed was, hey, read the Spirit Report. And I looked at the names, and those names have now been repeated to you for a while. A number of times today, these very, very prominent Native Hawaiians came together, and this was a grassroots effort. This was actually the Kona Hawaiian Civic Club, who was concerned with urbanization starting in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There was a plan by the landowner to actually blast out part of the Koloko fish pond wall to try and get a beach to accrete there as part of an overall resort development. And this community came together and they said, hey, what can we do? And they went to U.S. Representative Patsy Mink for help. And Patsy got the language passed to first create the advisory commission that created the Spirit Report, and then later the establishment of the national park by federal law in 1978. And I'll just say, I hope you will read the Spirit Report at some point, even though you are so busy. But the Spirit Report was very clear about the cultural significance of Maukazamakai groundwater flow for the resources of this area. And what's really amazing is when the Congress passed the law in 1978 that established the national park, they said two things. First of all, you should manage this park in accordance with the laws that manage all other national parks. So big places like Yellowstone and Yosemite, really famous, the same protections that apply there apply to this little place. And then also, specifically, and the Park Service shall try and manage this, I'm paraphrasing, in accordance with the Spirit Report. So they directed the National Park Service, follow the Spirit Report when you manage this national park. The Spirit Report itself, this is a diagram from the Spirit Report, said the dynamic thread that ties the environment together is water. What affected the Mauka regions affected the Makai. What affected the neighboring Ahupua'a affected it. What affected the land affected the fish ponds and the sea. And this knowledge was expressed further by cultural practitioners who are part of the founding commission, Mauna Roy, the late Mauna Roy, who was mentioned earlier today, in a proceeding before the State Land Use Commission, testified if we don't allow our freshwaters to produce the proper quantity of fish, we're not going to have our traditional practices. That cultural knowledge has been fully validated by science, and Paula will talk about that more. But I think it's really significant that Congress honored this cultural knowledge and said, NPS, follow it in your management of this park. The other thing that they said in the law, when they say the general laws that affect the National Park Service, the most important law that affects the National Park Service is the Organic Act that established the National Park Service. And the key language in there is that parks are to be managed unimpaired for future generations. And unimpaired means not, well, if you see an impact, then try and mitigate it or try and stop it. It actually means look forward in time. If you anticipate an impact, take the actions to prevent that impact from occurring. So again, whether it's Yellowstone or Yosemite or those famous places, or Koloko Honokohau National Historic Park, if you can see a impact that might be happening, take all the actions you can, and that's really the motivation that we have. I'll just do a little disclaimer here, and this is a wonderful gift that came from my late mother. These 3 bowls were all carved from a single koa log, nested one inside each other. And I put it up there, and with the Ololo Noeau, that translates to, not all knowledge is taught in the same school. I'm going to talk to you mostly today about the legal aspects of water. There are important economic aspects of water. There are important cultural aspects of water. And I think sometimes the difficulty we have when we have water discussions is that somebody's talking about the cultural side, and somebody's talking about the economic side, and somebody's talking about the legal side. Those are all valuable parts of the water picture. And I'm going to talk to you today just about the legal aspect of things as a context for understanding the petition. And really, in particular, I want to spend about 5 minutes of the next 10, when I'll be POW, talking about the evolution of Hawaii water law. I will caution you, there are entire semester-long courses at the University of Hawaii taught on the history of water law from 1848 and earlier through to today. There's entire books. There's a book called Water and the Law in Hawaii, written by Dr. Larry Miike, that talks about this history, and I'm going to try and cram it into 5 minutes. But really, basically, Hawaii water law has a number of important legal sources: kingdom law, court decisions made during the kingdom, traditional and customary practices, as well as English common law, statutory law as passed by the territorial and now state legislature, state constitutional provisions, and modern Supreme Court decisions. And it has a complex history, but the easiest way to think about it is that, to a certain degree, over the last 150 plus years, we've gone in a circle. Things started in the formalization of Hawaii water law at the Mahele, when land was privatized, and when the mo'i and the legislature of the kingdom were making this monumental decision to say, we think things will be better if we privatize land. They were really explicit in statements by the mo'i, statements by the legislature, and later the Land Commission. Water will not be privatized. Water is so important for all people that we don't want it to be privatized in the way that land is. So it will continue to be held by the mo'i, the king, Kamehameha III at the time, not as his own personal property, but as a trust that he held for the benefit of all the people in the kingdom. And that was the foundation of Hawaii water law. But what happened with the Mahele, of course, as everybody knows, is that very soon land went from Native Hawaiian hands, was concentrated in the hands of large plantations and ranches, and there was increasing economic and political power in the late kingdom, and then in the Republic of Hawaii, and then in the territory, in the hands of these interests. So certain practices started to happen on the ground. People bought kalolo'i, and they took the water from that lo'i, and they started to irrigate formerly dry kula lands to grow sugar on. And then they went to court when some Native Hawaiians said, hey, no can't do that, right? But folks came and said, no, no, no. The court said, no, that's acceptable. You can take former kala water and put it on dry land for sugar. They started to take water from one side of one ahupua'a, move it to another ahupua'a, even one side of an island, and move it to another island, or another side of the island, excuse me. And the court said, no, that's acceptable. And so over the course from the late kingdom until the early part of statehood, water started to be understood as private property. Water was literally, water rights were bought and sold. This made, if you know folks in the Hawaiian community, many Hawaiian families have stories about why did your folks move to the city. One of them was often the streams in their area simply got dried up by diversions. And that practice continued until the 1970s, when you had the Democratic Revolution and Hawaii Supreme Court justices appointed by a popularly elected governor, including part Hawaiian William S. Richardson, who the law school is named after. 2 sugar companies on the island of Kauai sued each other. They had been fighting for about 70 years over who owned how much water in the Hanapepe River. And in probably a decision that they will always regret, they went to circuit court and they said, who owns how much? And the court said, okay, you guys own this much and you guys own that much. And then they didn't like the result and they appealed it. And the Hawaii Supreme Court went all the way back to the kingdom law, and they said, oh, you know what, actually neither of you own it. Water in Hawaii is a public trust. And the state has an obligation as the successor sovereign, and that's the language in the court rulings, to manage Hawaii's water as a trust. That led eventually to the establishment, the passage of a number of constitutional amendments in 1978 calling for the legislature to create a water commission of 7 appointed members to act as the trustee for that public trust in water, and the passage of a water code. So that's the very brief history lesson on where we are now. Let me say a little bit more about the State Water Commission. There's 7 members. We're actually honored today. I didn't realize one of the 7 members is with us today, Commissioner Kamana Beamer. 2 members serve as automatically because of their appointment by the governor to other roles. So the chairperson of the Board of Land and Natural Resources serves as the chairperson of the Water Commission, currently William Ayla. The chairperson, the director of the Department of Health serves on the Water Commission. She has just been appointed, though not officially, last week after Loretta Fuddy passed away. And then there's 5 members at large who are appointed to the Water Commission by the governor and confirmed to the Senate. They are the ones who act as the trustees under the Water Code. But how the Water Code operates is a little bit complex, because when the constitutional amendment was passed in 1978, they said, actually, the amendment said, hey, within 1 year, you shall pass the Water Code and get this into action. It took till 1987. It would take 9 years of fighting. And one of the key fights, really, well, the overall fight was between large landed plantation interests versus the environmental and Native Hawaiian communities. But there was also significant concern at the county level from Maui County, who at that time was fearful of designation and state control of water management, that they would somehow be overregulated in their minds if the code passed in a certain way. So what was called the Maui Compromise, or splitting the baby, they said, okay, we agree, and the code is very clear. The state of Hawaii has an obligation to manage the state's water resources everywhere, but we're only going to actively manage it in designated water management areas. In other areas, we're going to much more passively manage water. And that was the compromise that it took after 9 years of deliberation to get the code passed. Now, 10 years after the code passed, there was a review commission set up by law that said, look at the water code, how it operates, what works, what doesn't. The number 1 recommendation from that commission was get rid of this designation process. It doesn't make sense. But the state legislature so far has not chosen to act on it. And what does the code say about designation? You heard 2 weeks ago about a number of criteria that are in the code that the Water Commission is supposed to look at when they're considering designation of water management area, but this is the preamble language. So this is like the key fundamental things that the Water Commission is supposed to look at. When it can be reasonably determined, after conducting scientific investigations and research, that the water resources in an area may be threatened, and these are my emphases, by existing or proposed withdrawals or diversions of water, the Commission shall designate the area for the purpose of establishing administrative control over the withdrawals and diversions of ground and surface waters in the area to ensure reasonable beneficial use of the water resources and the public interest. So that's the fundamental job that the Water Commission has now that the Park Service filed a petition. But what does designation actually mean? Well, let me first talk about what has been designated so far in Hawaii. Everything in blue on this slide is a designated groundwater management area. So all of the island of Oahu, except the Waianae aquifer sector, all groundwater on the island of Molokai, and the Iao aquifer on the island of Maui. Everything that is not colored blue has not been designated. There's also surface water designations, which is done by a different process. The only surface water management area in the state of Hawaii are the waters of Navaeha, or the 4 great waters of central Maui, Waihe'e, Wai'ehu, Iao, and Waikapu streams, which were once the largest contiguous area of kalo cultivation anywhere in the islands. But what's the big difference between a designated area and an undesignated area? There's a number of legal complexities, but ultimately, everywhere in the state right now, if you want to get water from underground, you file a well construction permit and a pump installation permit with the State Water Commission. So it's not a county role. The state already does this. The state is already the one entity that controls this. But those permits, 2 things. First of all, they are ministerial permits, meaning it doesn't go before the Water Commission. It's commission staff that says yes or no on them, and they are reviewed solely on a technical basis. Did you have a licensed well driller drill your well? Is your pump working the way that it's supposed to? In designated areas, you also get those 2 permits, but you also have to get a groundwater use permit for a groundwater management area. It looks just like this. And it asks a few questions. Is the proposed use of water consistent with county land use plans and designations? So the decisions you guys make about what land uses should be in a particular area, there's then that review and designation of, are the way you're using water supportive of that kind of land use? Is your use of water in the public interest? Another question to ask, is your use reasonable and beneficial? And reasonable basically means efficient. Are you proposing to use twice as much water for a certain use than anybody else in the state does? And then how are you impacting existing uses, and are you negatively affecting the rights of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands? People file this permit, and then the Water Commission, not the National Park Service, the Water Commission, in a public meeting, reviews this and decides whether or not to allocate that amount of water that the applicant has requested, or a lesser amount of water, or to ask for further information. And at that point, members of the public, be it general members of the public, entities like the National Park Service, or council members, could then come in and say, you know, we're concerned with this in this area, or we'd like to support this permit, and it becomes a public process that people can weigh in on versus the non-public process that exists now. The area that we're in particular talking about today is outlined in red on this map. This broader map is how the state of Hawaii identifies aquifer sectors and systems, basically where we think water is related to each other. So they think the water in this red area, Keauhou, if you drill a well in Keauhou, it's not going to affect Kiholo north of it so much, or Kealakua south of it so much. So it's a boundary of sort of where they think the underground hydrology is. And then within this red area is what we've petitioned the state to manage. So the remainder of Hawaii Island is not affected by this petition. Just so you know where this falls in relationship to your areas of jurisdiction, this area falls primarily within Councilmember Eoff's and Councilmember Kanuha's districts. So what has the National Park Service been doing? You know, over 6 years ago, as Superintendent Duchesne mentioned, we started a groundwater working group saying, hey, you know, we have concerns here. Let's talk story about this. Then the Department of Water Supply started a Kona Water Roundtable. As Tammy also mentioned, 15 years of scientific research, which has confirmed the cultural knowledge that water is very significant to the coast in this area. Every time we've had an opportunity, practically, we've commented on environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, asked about the long-term impacts of water withdrawals. We've sent in comments on those well construction permits and those pump installation permits, but those comments haven't really resulted in meaningful action, and we spent a lot of time one-on-one talking story with people. But what really we found after 6 years of active talk story was we actually couldn't even come to agreement that there was a threat with some of the stakeholders. And finally, there came time to act for the Park Service when we saw, based on the scientific knowledge that we had, that there is a foreseeable threat, so we filed the petition on September 13th. What's happened now, we're in this phase of the designation process, as Roy Hardy and Bill Tam of the Water Commission talked to you about 2 weeks ago, where they are consulting, but we are also trying our best to consult with the County Council, the Mayor, and the Water Board about what this issue is, what the implications are of designation, how does it work in detail. The Water Commission is waiting for further scientific investigations from the University of Hawaii and the U.S. Geological Survey to be finished. And eventually the chairperson, along with the commission, will recommend whether or not they want to continue the process. Now, if the Water Commission in December of 2014, when they said they'd make a decision by, continues the process, that's not even designation. All that is they then go to formal fact-finding and hold a hearing on this island. So at this point, we're not even like seeking designation. We're seeking we'd like you to continue the process and hold a public hearing of the Water Commission on this island so people can weigh in further. That is the end of my presentation for now, and I can hand it over to Dr. Cutillo. Mahalo for your attention.